question, I want to focus on a new documentary film, which does have some links to what we've been talking about this evening. Businessman Guy Pinsent emigrated to Poland for work almost 20 years ago, but now he's the co-creator of a new documentary film which poses a question of people who've moved abroad for economic reasons, like he has. Should Brits come home? Well, Guy explained why some of the people he spoke to for this film have chosen to return to Britain permanently.
Ultimately, it's a personal decision. One is torn all sorts of ways as a Brit, and this was the point of making the documentary. How, let's look at this, let's see what people are thinking in Britain. People in the media are mostly commenting about people leaving the UK, and I think politicians in this country should think about not only the people who might be leaving, but how to attract people back who can help Britain grow again.
So what factors are involved in people making that decision? It can't just be all about tax rates, can it?
No, it can't just be about tax rates, but if you're going to look at it in a full spectrum of all the pros and cons, I think tax discrepancies between Britain and places where expats are living could be a major factor, possibly the highest weighting in the decision. When you look at tax rates in places like Dubai, Singapore, and even Poland, compared to Britain today. But of course, as Brits, we are pulled to Britain because it's in our DNA.
Well, you say we, but you've forsaken these shores, and you've lived in Poland for quite some time.
Certainly.
And I guess sort of the running theme of the documentary is, well, should I be thinking about coming back? But you've made your life in a new country. What factors come into it for you personally?
Well, obviously my parents live in England and they're not getting any younger, so that's a clear factor. I was educated in Britain, born in London, lived all my life in Britain until I left 19 and a half years ago. I had 2 years posting with the Foreign Office in Warsaw, which gave me the sort of spark for a potential new career in Poland. And I think, like many people in and outside the UK and across the globe, Brits and non-Brits, with aghast at what's going on in this country. And so I think part of the pull is I've got to come back and stand up for what I believe Britain is great for before it's lost. And that point's made in the documentary, I think, by a few people, not least by Professor David Betts.
So you've talked to all sorts of different people in this documentary, all around the country, different types of people, just ordinary members of the public, academics, people like me.
Yes.
What did you learn? What did you learn that was new? What were you surprised by?
I think one thing that came across very strongly is a consistent belief in Britain in spite of a paucity of good leadership in the country. And that was really reassuring. One case in point, we went to the Notting Hill Carnival, meeting all sorts of people. There was a lovely Ghanaian couple who, it didn't make it into the edit for the documentary, but they voted Labour at the last general election nearly a year and a half ago, and were utterly furious with what's going on with this current Labour government. And
in what specifically?
Being taxed to death. Broken promise of no rising in tax and taxes going up.
It was before the budget.
It was before the general election as well.
Oh, right.
So we've had two budgets of broken promises of higher tax. And so that was extraordinary. Lifelong Labour voters, people who would naturally go towards the Labour Party, but are now completely furious and saying, never again are we voting Labour. And in fact, we think we would now have a better life back in Ghana than we would in Britain. And that really is quite shocking.
Did you get a sense that there is this sort of growing disillusion with both of the main parties? The Conservatives let people down, Labour now seem to be letting people down. What sense did you get of what comes next? Because if, for example, Nigel Farage wins the next election or becomes Prime Minister in a minority government or whatever, what if he fails? Because then there really would be complete disillusion. And I don't think people are going to then say, oh, well, let's give the Liberal Democrats a chance. What happens then?
Well, who was it that said that predictions is for fools, Ian? I'm really not going to make any predictions.
It's my job.
One doesn't know, but that line of questioning gives fuel to the argument which Professor David Betts was making. quite startling, shocking, terrifying prediction that we are on a road to civil war. I can't bear to contemplate the thought when he was saying this. The physiological reaction is shock and horror to think that could be happening, and yet he articulates that case very well.
What do Polish people think of this country now?
I think Poles, having been wiped off the map at the end of the 18th century for 123 years, then had their independence briefly for just under 20 years from the end of World War I until 1939. 1939, brutally divided by the Russians and the Nazis, kicked out of their country, or the leadership was. The elite intelligentsia were signed off by Stalin to be massacred in Katyn and a couple of other locations. And then at the end of the World War II, they of course felt they were sold out by Britain and America to Stalin. I think that's a bit unfair. The real politic of the time actually meant that Britain and America could not throw the Red Army out of Poland and give Poland proper independence. But then, having had that 45 years of brutal communism, Poland has been like a sort of compressed spring for the best part of 2 centuries, and they remember that awful communist oppression and ghastly socialist experiment, and that's why they've got this huge entrepreneurial energy and have built a much better country. In the space of 30 years, Poland is now, on a purchasing power parity basis, on course to become as wealthy as Britain in the next 5 years. And that is extraordinary, and it just shows what happens when you have a free society, and freedom means lower government involvement in the economy, and it just takes off.
And they've done that despite a huge exodus of people to other European countries and, of course, Britain. I mean, back in, 20 years ago, there was a huge influx from Poland.
Yes.
And, I mean, some of those people have gone back to Poland, but we still have hundreds of thousands of Polish nationals really helping make Britain what it is today.
Absolutely. Well, there were 3 waves of Poles coming to Britain. There was those that stayed and were then suddenly ostracised because of the ghastly politics in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Then there was another wave, when was it, another big exodus in the early 90s. And then, obviously, with Poland joining the European Union in May 2004, big waves followed. And so the Poles have been a huge contributing factor to Britain and its history. Arguably, Squadron 303 in the Battle of Britain in those dark days of autumn 1940 made the difference between Britain winning and losing the Battle of Britain against the Luftwaffe.
And that's an interesting point in itself, isn't it? Because we often talk about Britain standing alone. You think, well, not quite, because we had all those Polish pilots. We had people from the Empire fighting on behalf of Britain throughout the world. So yes, in some ways Britain stood alone, but not every way. So what was your conclusion from making the documentary? Did it make you change your mind about anything?
I think the jury's still out. And I don't mean that in a facetious way to say, well, come on, you've got to get off the fence. I mean, there is genuine push and pull factors. I've been very lucky to have made a good life for myself in Poland. Lots of people from around the world come to Poland. I mean, I know expats from Sweden, Denmark, as well as Britain, Ireland, America, thinking that Poland's a great business environment and we're going to go ahead and make lots of money, but it doesn't just happen. You need a bit of luck as well as the old graft, hard work, and so it hasn't been automatic. But as I said earlier just now, I worry deeply about the direction of travel in this country, and although hope springs eternal, I think, as we're seeing, for example, with Javier Milei in Argentina, within 2 years, well, actually within a year, he'd already made the economy bigger, reversing decades and decades of socialist decline in Argentina and stopping this kleptocracy. He's now turning it around and people and investments pouring in, and the economy's really picking up. So it can always change. As we saw in Britain at the end of the 70s, it was in dire straits, rubbish not being collected, general strikes, not enough electricity being rationed and so on. And it was turned around by Thatcher and Lawson and their cabinet intellectual powerhouses to put Britain back on the rails. So it can happen again, but sooner the better.
That's the businessman Guy Pinsent, who's the co-creator of a new documentary called Should Brits Come Home? If you just search for that title online, you'll be able to find the full film on YouTube. Coming up in the next